The risk will always be if they said no, that there could be a short gap in between, because obviously any connection onto Pike Right Way will need their consent. However, I can't see that being a likely proposition from County Council.
So that's exactly the position I reached in my closings. I'll address you that at the end of my closings, but yeah, that's right, and it can be dealt with by this condition. So the only point I was going to add is it's actually Mr. Point Mr. Brown's just made in this draft condition. Apologies, the bit at the end of this new condition, the development shall thereafter be carried out as approved, might be better to say the link shall be provided as approved. Otherwise, the development might be sort of a slightly wider concept. Hope that's okay.
That's fine. Okay, so I will accept this document as ID 22. Are there any other comments people would like to make on the condition? Okay, thank you. We don't need to spend any further time. I did see a hand at the back. Everything's working fine. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So before I close formally the roundtable session on conditions and planning obligations, we did cover everything, I think, yesterday, but if there is anything else, please tell me now.
The only thing from us is, did you want to know the result from yesterday evening with regards to English review? And
I was going
to be told.
Yes, I was going to come on to that next. Is there anything you want to tell me about that? I mean, I'm not inviting evidence necessarily, but it is up to you whether you think I need to be made aware of additional points in relation to that matter, or evidence even. So I'll start with Mr. Phillips.
The single issue review was adopted last night unanimously. If you want certain writing, I can get it for you, but any sort of formal document will take a few days to be drawn up. It has to be an official record.
Okay, so for the purposes of this inquiry, is that agreed? Yes, okay. And in relation to the adopted policy and documentation, I have copies of that already, don't I? This was just the formality, or well, not the formality, but this was a process of formally adopting that through the council's process.
Yes, that was the council process to adopt this English review.
Okay, well, I don't think I need any evidence. It's been aired during this inquiry and it doesn't involve any further written evidence as far as I can see. So I've recorded that, obviously, and I'll note that and take that into account in making my decision. So I am going to move on to closings now. The gentleman at the back, are you? Yes, okay, that's fine. Just double checking that I've not missed anyone who wishes to participate, that's all. Thank you. Mr. Smythe, you're first, well, on the stands, probably the wrong phrase, but you're the first in line to give your closing. Are you in a position to do so? Yes, okay. And you have a copy of the closing. Okay, thank you. Yes, I would normally adjourn after the first closing anyway, just to give you an opportunity to do that. And Mr. Smythe, if you do need time now, please do let me know. Otherwise, happy for you to proceed at your will.
Thank you, sir. The council does not object to the proposed amendments to the plans. The previous inspector's decision represents a material consideration of the greatest relevance. The merits of the appeal were fully ventilated and considered by your colleague. The council fully accepts this decision. It represents a very, very helpful starting point. As was made clear in opening, the council's approach to this appeal is simply updating the planning judgments of the decision letter in light of changes in circumstances. The development plan, the starting point for decision making is to answer this question: does the appeal comply with the development plan as a whole? It's obvious that it does not. Mr. Brown agreed in cross-examination that the appeal was contrary to ENV1 ENV2, ENV11, ENV12, and Growth 2 when read literally. That your colleague found that the appeal offended ENV1, ENV2, Growth 2, and HOU 6. Your colleague did not expressly make a finding about whether the appeal complied with the development plan as a whole, but a fair reading of the decision leads one to the conclusion that he decided that it did not. It was unattractive for Mr. Brown to persist with the contention that the appeal complies with the development plan as a whole on the basis that it complies with the Greenbelt policy ENV10. One might have expected the appellant's case to have been that it conceded that the appeal was contrary to the development plan, but the benefits were so potent so as to constitute very special circumstances, which meant that material considerations overrode the conflict with the development plan, but that is not its case. It's obvious that the appeal offends HOU 6 as it's common ground that the appeal causes low to moderate harm, landscape harm, and so impermissibly causes an adverse impact on the character of the locality, contrary to the first element of HOU 6. That is what your colleague found last time. It's equally obvious that the appeal offends Growth 2. That is what your colleague found previously. That is what the appellant's planning statement says. To that end, Mr. Brown finds himself in a minority of one. The policy is breached given that Mr. Brown agreed in cross-examination that ENV1, ENV2, ENV11, ENV12 are offended, and so it follows the appeal fails a requirement that other local plan policies are satisfied. Further, if you, sir, find conflict with HOU 6, the exception built into Growth 2 is closed off, and the appeal offends Growth 2. In cross-examination, Mr. Brown agreed that if one interpreted the policy quote unquote literally, it was offended. This is not understood. The council is not adopting a legalistic or artificial approach to construction. The words of Growth 2 are written in everyday English. They are what they are. It's obvious that the appeal is contrary to that policy. Compliance or otherwise with ENV12, ENV10, the Greenbelt policy, turns on the national test of very special circumstances. So where does that leave us? So if you find that the appeal complies with the development plan, the council encourages you to allow the appeal. If you, on the other hand, find conflict with the development plan, the council submits the appeal should be dismissed. Why? It's common ground following cross-examination of Mr. Brown that the council can demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply and the supply position is not precarious. The development plan is up to date and the proposal should be judged in accordance with it. And Growth 1 and 2, which set out the locational strategy for the district, are up to date and should be afforded full weight. Conflict with an up-to-date development plan does not mean the appeal must fail, but it provides a very inhospitable environment for the appellant to satisfy you that the operation of the 38(6) statutory duty points towards the grant of permission. The appellant's task would be easier if the development plan was out of date, but it's not. The absence of the pedestrian footway onto Rowan Close. The proposal which was before your colleague and which was before the council when it considered the planning application promoted a pedestrian link at the western edge of the site, which was to provide ready and convenient access for pedestrians right into the village. This was an important feature intended to promote sustainable transport choices and discourage unnecessary trips by the private car. After the appeal was lodged, the appellant informed the council that it no longer promoted this element. This omission detracts from the sustainability credentials of the site. It means that the site is less modally sustainable than when it was promoted at the last appeal. It means that the pedestrian route into the village is less convenient, less direct, and less attractive, particularly in respect of those living in the affordable units. It also means that it would be less convenient, less direct, and less attractive for those living in the village itself, in or around Rowan Close, to make use of the play area on the appeal site. This inevitably diminishes the benefits in respect to pedestrian access for those living both on the western part of the appeal site and the wider village use of the public open space, particularly for those living on the village's eastern edge. The Highway Authority has not been consulted upon this material change. It gave its consultation response on the basis of the presence of the pedestrian link. A greenway is intended to promote cycling between Cambridge and Bottisham. The absence of the Rowan Close link represents a lost opportunity. Had the link remained in place, it would have represented a direct, convenient and attractive route. The council has been at pains to make clear that the absence of the pedestrian link does not render the appeal unacceptable. However, it has the effect of reducing the weight of the benefits and lowering the sustainability credentials of the appeal. In cross-examination, Mr. Phillips said that the weight should be downgraded to low, moderate, positive from what was given by the previous inspector. Again, this makes it all the more difficult for the appellant to demonstrate that the benefits clearly outweigh the harms, so as to amount to very special circumstances. The alternative site assessment. The site search for the ASA was undertaken by the appellant in September last year. It's the appellant's case that it has undertaken a thorough and comprehensive assessment of both the district and the wider market area, which demonstrate there is no other place to locate the appeal. This is a bold assertion, given that it's common ground that only 3% of the district is greenbelt. Given that it's so intrinsically unlikely that there is no alternative non-greenbelt site available in the remaining 97% of the district, the onus is squarely on the shoulders of the appellant to satisfy you that the ASA is thorough, comprehensive, and robust. This is the appellant's second go. The appellant, informed by the interrogation of the first ASA by the previous inspector, has had the time and resources to recast its ASA in a way which banishes all doubt and uncertainty. It ought to be unimpeachable. The appellant knows and has known from the outset the council does not advance a positive case identifying specific sites which are suitable and available. The council does not have the resources to draft its own rival ASA. This means there is an even greater onus upon the appellant to ensure that the ASA, which is the only ASA before the inquiry, is thorough and robust. Given the appellant knows that it's the only one calling expert alternative science evidence, it's all the more important that the evidence is objective and comprehensive. The second ASA does not command confidence for 4 reasons. Firstly, that the Gerald Eve review identifies 5 candidates which had not been assessed at all by the ASA is troubling, and a further 9 sites which were not adequately assessed. Even if ultimately the appellant can show that each of these are not in fact runners, that does not detract from the force that the ASA is insufficiently comprehensive to be relied upon. As I observed in opening, if a short review has thrown up 5 sites which the appellant failed to identify, how many more sites has the appellant missed? This is not nitpicking. Had the council not commissioned its ASA review, doubtless you, sir, would have proceeded to have determined the appeal entirely ignorant of these 5 sites. In opening, Mr. Walton made the point that the council's had years to identify an alternative site, but has been unable to do so. This is not fair. Mr. Phillips is busily focusing on the cases which have been allocated to him. To the extent that any potential alternative sites come to his attention, save for the Gerald Eve review, it's pure good luck through random interactions with officers and land agents. Second, there's no evidence of any attempts whatsoever to contact landowners. The search appears to be focused on land agents, which Carter Jonas were in contact with. This is a surprising omission. If the appellant really wants to find out if there are alternative sites, one would have expected it to have made some attempt to contact landowners, as this could have thrown up sites which were unknown to the land agents to which Carter Jonas was in contact. Third, the search undertaken by the appellant lacks transparency. We have some negative emails from the land agents, but none of the original emails which elicited the response. This is a serious shortcoming. It's suspicious. Plainly, the way in which a request is worded can influence how the recipient chooses to respond. A request drafted in a certain way can lead to an unfavourable reply. The appellant's script does not inspire confidence. It appears short, abrupt, and lacking in detail. It hardly seems designed to elicit favourable responses. When I challenged the absence of any chases of land agents during the round table, in light of the small number of responses, Mr. Canavan told the inquiry that round-robin emails were sent, but these have not been provided to the council or the inquiry. Generic round-robin emails are likely to be less adept at drawing out favourable responses than direct overtures. One is left with the impression that the ASA evidence gathering was half-hearted rather than full-blooded. There is the whiff of the appellant going through the motions rather than enthusiastically and systematically trying to ferret out alternative sites. Fourth, the appeal is promoted on the basis the extra care living offer requires a minimum of 100 units to be viable. The council remains unpersuaded that this is right. There are 18 examples of extra care housing sites below 100 units in this market area, and importantly, 3 examples of private extra care housing sites comprising 47, 46 and 37 units respectively. This evidence sits uncomfortably with the appellant's case that a 100-unit minimum must be satisfied. In reality, a far larger degree of flexibility exists than the appellant's needs assessment allows. There appears to be much more scope to meet the need on smaller sites than the appellant envisages. Where does that leave us? You, sir, are invited to find the appellant has not satisfied you that there is no prospect for an alternative site in the non-green belt. The ASA is inadequate and unsatisfactory for the reasons given. That is sufficient for you to decide the point. This is a good point, even if the council cannot identify an alternative site. Why? It's never been the council's case that it's never been the council's position that it advanced a positive case of identifying firm alternative sites. Following the round table, the council remains of the view that sites 2, 11 and 14, which are within the district and outside the green belt, are potential candidates. Doubtless you, sir, have taken a good note of what is said. And the evidence from the respective parties. It's not repeated here, save to make 2 observations. First, the appellant seeks to knock out site 2 on the basis that it will provide units within 5 years. Mr. Phillips confirmed during the round table that he expected commencement but not completion of units within 5 years. But on that strict basis, one should knock out the appeal site, as it will not deliver within 5 years. The appellant began promoting the site in 2019 and applied for planning permission in 2020. Therefore, against the 5-year parameter, units in the appeal site should be built by the end of 2025. Secondly, in respect to the Kennet site, it has a general residential use with a broad description development. And I note the word including within the text, which does not preclude an extra care village. The design code which the appellant provided on the second day does not assist its case. It reveals a deliberately broad illustrative plan, which is compatible with the appeal scheme's vision. It would simply require an application to vary condition 5 to increase the floor space. Such a course would be unremarkable. It does not provide a serious impediment. Further, the key principles of the design code expressly indicate that taller buildings would be suitable in the eastern part of the village centre. This provides further flexibility as increased floor space can be provided by adding stories. Yesterday, Mr. Walton made reference more than once to concessions made by Mr. Phillips in cross-examination on the second day. I turned to make submissions on the weight to be afforded these concessions. What were the circumstances in which these were elicited? So you directed and the parties agreed to deal with the issue of alternative sites as a round table. Mr. Walton cross-examined Mr. Phillips on the issue during the planning evidence session. This was inappropriate and contrary to the inquiry timetable. You, sir, intervened, indicating this was an issue which had been dealt with before. Mr. Walton persisted. After Mr. Phillips had made a number of concessions based upon questions which elided a future need for this type of development with reasonable sites, a distinction which the witness did not pick up upon, I lodged an objection. I did not lodge an objection earlier, as the questions were couched in terms of what weight the witness gave to point X or Y, which was arguably a question of the final planning balance. Why is this unfair? The appellant reopened the issue of alternative sites in Mr. Phillips's cross-examination. This was an ambush. Mr. Phillips was not expecting to deal with it. No questions were asked about alternative sites in evidence in chief. The council has been denied the opportunity to cross-examine Mr. Canavan. He disappeared after the first day. So the position is thus: the appellant had the chance to improve its case post-round table by cross-examining Mr. Phillips, but the council has not had the chance to cross-examine Mr. Canavan. This risks being procedurally unfair. Having lodged my objection, I asked whether Mr. Canavan would attend to give evidence on the third day. Answer came there none. The inquiry then got sidetracked with a demand that I withdraw the word trick, which I did. In these murky waters, the inspector, so you, sir, are invited to approach with caution the concessions made by Mr. Phillips, because firstly, the council has not had the chance to challenge Mr. Canavan, and secondly, plainly, Mr. Phillips misunderstood the premise of those questions. Why do I say that? Mr. Walton repeatedly asked Mr. Phillips questions which were predicated on the following words to the effect, based upon the evidence before the inquiry, do you accept ... But that's the whole point. The only evidence on alternative sites is from the appellant. The council regards it as self-serving. The council's point, which was raised colourfully in opening, and so there can be no doubt about it, was that the ASA was not robust. The ASA has all the hallmarks of a half-hearted attempt, which gives the impression of performing a thorough search, but in reality was little more than going through the motions. How else does one explain the weird script or the absence of the requests which gave rise to the emails, replies from the land agents? All of this would have been interrogated forcefully during the course of cross-examination of Mr. Canavan, but you, sir, directed that the matter would be best dealt with by way of a round table. Further, I would have pressed Mr. Canavan in cross-examination how it was that his ASA, if his ASA was robust and thorough, he missed 5 sites. Again, sir, I raised this in opening. No explanation was provided during the round table. Plainly, if the ASA is inadequate, to use Mr. Walton's framing in cross-examination, the evidence before the inquiry is inadequate. Accordingly, the concessions were narrowly based upon the evidence before the inquiry. It's in this context which informs the weight to be given to Mr. Phillips's concessions. Standing back and looking at matters in the round, can you, sir, be confident that development of this type and extent cannot come forward outside of the Greenbelt? It's a council's case. The evidence is insufficiently robust and unambiguous to justify the answer yes. There is sufficient doubt about the robustness of the ASA and whether the potential sites can be disregarded to satisfy the inquiry. Finally, sir, there's always a risk of getting lost in the detail, but let us return to first principles. What is the point of an ASA and seeking to identify alternative sites? It's intended to help you, sir, answer this question. Is this a case where it's inevitable that the proposal will be located within the Greenbelt? The ASA is not an end in itself. It's an important piece of evidence which informs this wider planning judgment. If you, sir, don't identify a reasonable alternative site, it doesn't follow that it's inevitable that the proposal will be located within the Greenbelt. The logic of the appellant's case can thus be expressed. 1, there's nowhere else for the development to go anywhere in 97% of the district, which is non-Greenbelt. Number 2, the only place for the appeal is an open countryside within both the Greenbelt and the setting of designated heritage assets. And 3, the council say that those observations are improbable. Turning to the council's locational strategy, at the time of the last appeal, it was agreed that Grove 1 and Grove 2 were out of date as the evidence base for the housing requirement was stale. It's common ground that following full council approval last night, that full weight can be afforded to Grove 1 and Grove 2. The implications on the determination of the appeal are considerable. Your colleague found the appeal offended Grove 2. However, it wasn't determinative at that time because your colleague found that Grove 2 was out of date, and so only limited weight was afforded to that conflict. Significantly more weight ought to be attached to the conflict with Grove 2 now. It submitted the location of the appeal site is unsustainable as it lies in the open countryside within the Greenbelt and contrary to the locational strategy of the local plan, which seeks to focus development in the 3 market towns of the district, and which strictly controls development beyond settlement boundaries. Turning to affordable housing, the development plan requires a 40% contribution towards affordable housing. The council accepted the viability assessment such that the proposal can support 30% affordable housing. At the time of the last appeal, the inspector gave substantial weight to the benefit arising from the provision of affordable housing. This was unsurprising as the extent of the shortfall was great. There was an outstanding need for 561 affordable units. Since then, the council has built 335 affordable units. Notwithstanding the council's failure in the previous decade, the situation has improved markedly since the last appeal. The last 2 years have been the best in the last decade for building affordable housing. To reflect this improvement, the council contends for significant rather than substantial weight to this benefit. It follows that the weight to be given to this benefit is a little less now than it was last time. It's difficult to see how a maximum provision of 51 affordable units constitutes a substantial benefit. Turning to heritage, it's common ground. The appeal causes low to moderate harm to the setting of the Grade 2 Bottisham Hall and the conservation area. The harm caused in a binary sense is less than substantial. This means that the appeal offends ENV 11 and ENV 12. Considerable importance and weight must be attached to the desirability of preserving and enhancing their significance, and that the heritage harm is not itself a showstopper, i.e. capable of itself to justify the dismissal of the appeal. The council agrees that the public benefits in isolation of the Greenbelt harm outweighs the harm. So in conclusion, sir, the appeal is contrary to the development plan. The onus is upon the appellant to demonstrate material considerations forming very special circumstances which justify a departure from the development plan. The considerations against the appeal remain great. Substantial weight to the harm caused to the Greenbelt, low to moderate harm to the designated heritage assets of the conservation area and Bottisham Hall, which should be given considerable importance and weight, low to moderate harm to the character and appearance of the area, harm to the locational strategy of the local plan as set out by Grove 2, and the loss of open countryside. The council recognises that the appeal gives rise to a number of benefits which ought to be afforded significant weight, although these benefits are less potent than they were last time. It's submitted that these benefits do not clearly outweigh the harm caused, so as to demonstrate very special circumstances. Finally, it's noted that the council, in its view, finds itself in a stronger position to resist the appeal compared with last time. Firstly, because of the enhanced weight to Grove 2. Secondly, the loss of the pedestrian footway. And thirdly, the diminished weight to the benefit of affordable housing, as the provision has increased considerably in the last 2 years. If the appeal was unacceptable last time, that planning judgment is even more apt now. So for those reasons, we invite you to dismiss the appeal.
Thank you, Mr. Smythe. Shall we take a short break? Is 10 minutes sufficient?
So I'm sure we probably won't even need that much. It's out for printing. So if we said one.
We'll come back at 10 past then, 7 minutes.
Perfect.
Yes, okay, we'll adjourn now until 10. Mr. Walton, it seems like you're ready to hand me your closing. Thank you. Thank you. And in your own time, Mr. Walton.
So these submissions don't rehearse the evidence that's been presented to you, sir, but their purpose is to provide you with a route map to making a lawful decision and to summarise what has become obvious for all to see, that the only sensible decision here is to allow the appeal and to grant permission so that this much needed scheme can come forward without any further delay. They also provide in italics a response to some of what's said in the council's closings, which regrettably amount to a clear divergence from reality. There was a good deal of common ground between the parties before the inquiry started, and there's a lot more now, given the very extensive concessions the council made in the ASA roundtable and in Mr. Phillips's cross-examination. And in the end, and taking everything else into account, this all boils down to two very simple points. It's common ground that if you conclude that there are no reasonable alternative sites that are likely to come forward to meet the need for private extra care by the end of 2026, you should grant permission. And it's common ground that on the evidence before you, that is the conclusion you should reach. Now, that's on the evidence before you, and that, of course, just picking up a point that was made in closing, that's the only basis on which you can proceed. You can't proceed on the basis that evidence is not before you. So it's common ground on the evidence before you, before this inquiry, that is the conclusion you should reach. And that, of course, is an end to the council's case and the clearest possible vindication of the appellant's position. And I've typed up in the footnotes there some direct quotes from the transcript in terms of those concessions, and just flagging, of course, whilst there's criticism or rather suggestions from the LPA as to the weight that should be given to those concessions, there's nothing from the LPA to suggest, rightly, of course, that those concessions weren't in fact made. So, given that it's now the position, this is now the position we're in, it's really not necessary to go further. Permission should obviously be granted. But for completeness, these submissions set out the broader picture and explain a little of how we've got to where we are. I start, of course, with section 38(6) of the 2004 Act, and that mandates that the appeal must be determined in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. It will therefore be necessary for you to decide whether the scheme complies with the development plan as a whole. It's common ground that the appeal scheme doesn't comply with every policy in the plan, but as case law establishes, it's not necessary for a development proposal to comply with every policy in the plan in order to comply with the plan as a whole. Here, though, in my submission, the approach is simple and obvious. The very special circumstances test set out in NPPF 148 is incorporated into, that is to say, it is part and parcel of policy EMB 10 of the local plan. In other words, the plan positively endorses the construction of what's Brack called inappropriate development in the Greenbelt where justified by very special circumstances. That's to say, properly applying EMB 10, inappropriate development that's justified by very special circumstances is policy compliant. It's not a departure from the plan or a breach of it in the sense we're talking. And critically, given that the VSC test is embedded in the plan, you will need to consider whether there are very special circumstances when you are considering whether the scheme complies with the plan as a whole. And whether or not there are special circumstances will depend on an analysis of all the scheme's harms and all the benefits, taking into account all relevant development plan policies. It follows in my submission that the VSC test is a simple way of testing whether the scheme complies with the development plan as a whole. Come then to what I describe as a very bleak picture. In a little more detail, and it was all fully accepted by Mr. Phillips in cross-examination, it's now common ground that if the scheme's benefits clearly outweigh its harms, you should allow the appeal and grant permission. And that boils down to the simple test, which, as I've set out above, permission should be granted if the conclusion is reached that no other sites are going to come forward to meet the need for private extra care in the timescales we're talking about. And the need for private extra care here, well in excess of 300 units, is acute. And as the MPPG government makes clear, it's critical that this need is met. The need for affordable housing is also acute. The council needing to deliver more than 200 units a year from 2020 through to 2040. These are the needs of some of the most vulnerable in our society, which the council has consistently failed to meet. And in failing to meet these needs, the council is failing to meet important government objectives, including, of course, that of ensuring that a sufficient number and range of homes can be provided to meet the needs of present, that's now, and future generations. All this, as I say, it's all common ground. The common ground continues that failure, both in regard to private extra care and affordable housing, is unacceptable. that the council's local plan has no allocations providing for any extra care housing, whether affordable or private. Common ground that it's there, the council is therefore wholly reliant on the market bringing forward non-allocated sites for private extra care. That the market has delivered only one private extra care scheme over the past decade or more, and that's the 57-bed scheme in Ely. Just pausing there, just doing some maths. On current rates of delivery at over 5 units a year over the last decade or so, it would take the council over 70 years to make up the current shortfall of private extra care. In this regard, East Cambridgeshire, again, common ground, is an area of sustained market failure. Again, common ground, the council has never come close to meeting its affordable housing needs. As set out above, it currently needs to provide more than 200 units a year. On average, 67 a year have come forward over the past decade or so. In that regard too, an area of very sustained market failure. Common ground, there's no evidence on which it can be concluded that the existing private care needs will be met within the next 5 years by development coming forward on any other site in the district. Common ground that the need for private extra care units would remain an acute and unacceptable, even with the appeal scheme consented and built out. But the appeal scheme is locationally sustainable for the scheme. The site, is locationally sustainable for the scheme in terms of easy access to an appropriate range of services and facilities, even with the new access proposals, and there are no other technical constraints to delivery. Contrast that with the huge benefits. In addition to all of this, there's no challenge at all from the council. That's to say, it's yet more common ground that the appeal scheme would deliver some very profound social benefits. As set out above, in policy terms, the government's clear that all kinds of market and affordable housing are needed. But it's this need for housing for older people in particular, and only that kind of housing, which is described as critical. And the benefits associated with retirement villages are very well evidenced. See the raft of studies and reports before the inquiry, the contents of which are all again unchallenged, all set out in Mrs. Venable's unchallenged evidence. In short, those documents explain that extra care leads to very significant improvements to residents' exercise, perceived health, independence, walking speed, including reductions in risk of falls and frailty. Life expectancy increases not just by months, but sometimes by several years. In terms of psychological well-being, it reduces levels of depression, anxiety, loneliness, isolation. It is to improvements in memory and cognitive skills, and residents report considerably improved sense in their quality of life. In addition, residents make more effective use of healthcare resources, reducing visits to GPs, reduced ambulance call-out, reduced hospital stays, and making more efficient use of care workers. Residents average several days less per year in hospital, which saves the NHS thousands of pounds per resident per year. This means the NHS will have extra resources and money with which to tackle a range of other urgent health challenges. And we know, of course, that extra care accommodations cope particularly well through the pandemic. So it's no surprise to see this model at the heart of the government's plans in the recent social care white paper. To be clear, all of these benefits are accepted by the council. None are challenged. And they've been consistently given substantial or indeed very substantial weight in a raft of appeal decisions. And I give you some there. The benefits don't stop there. 90% of older people in Cambridgeshire live in homes which are underoccupied. The scheme will free up housing, about 113 units. That point, again, has been endorsed by experienced inspectors in other appeals. There are some references. On Dr. Keith's concerns, the issue here really is whether the appeal scheme would bring too many people into the catchment of Dr. Keith's surgery. And the wider context is, of course, that the fact that the 65 plus population across the district generally is predicted to grow hugely over the coming decades in any event. And the narrower context is the evidence that people moving into schemes such as this don't tend to come from too far away. And the specific context is Dr. Keith's mistaken assertion that there's no material difference between the appeal scheme and a care home, and that's fundamental to her case, and it's wrong. It's proven the distinction is not only in the PPG, but the various benefits of retirement care villages, including to GP surgeries and the NHS more widely, are demonstrated by evidence that's not contested. In terms of funding, that falls on the clinical commissioning group, which of course will have to make appropriate funding arrangements going forward, regardless of the appeal scheme, most obviously to deal with changing demographics over the coming years. The population, not just of Bottisham, but of this district, as I say, is already older, and it will continue to grow in age with or without the scheme. And it's the legal function of the CCG to treat that population and to ensure that appropriate resources are allocated to ensure that can be done. And if there is, as Dr. Keith contends, a particularly older population in Bottisham, that makes this location more, not less appropriate for retirement care village to accommodate that population. Because of the benefits of the healthcare system associated with the scheme, see, for example, the huge savings compared to the provision of domiciliary care to individual but dispersed homeowners, and because of the CCG's role in strategic planning, there's no necessity for a contribution. That said, Although we don't accept the necessity for the contribution sought, the 106 includes provisions for the contribution sought by the relevant body. There therefore can be no objection to the scheme on the basis of its healthcare impacts, and that is a matter of common ground with the council. In those circumstances, the raft of appeal decisions in the core documents support giving at least substantial weight to the delivery of specialist housing, and the council is plainly wrong to give it any significant weight. And remember, of course, that this was a finely balanced decision for the council. The total collapse of the council's case. In terms of alternative sites, the council's position has obviously entirely collapsed over the course of the inquiry. In his proof, Mr. Phillips asserted that it was highly likely that the need for private extra care would be met from sites coming forward within the urban area. His position was, by the time we got to the start of the inquiry, that there were 15 sites that might deliver private extra care housings within a 5-year timescale. And that list was reduced to 5 by the end of the round table, as confirmed by Mr. Smythe. Mr. Phillips then accepted in cross-examination that sites 4 and 5, even if they came forward, wouldn't meet the need for further units in East Cambridgeshire, as they're outside the district. That left 3 sites. Mr. Phillips then accepted in cross-examination that site 14 wouldn't be likely to deliver any units inside 5 years. That's his spade in the ground point. 5 years is, of course, the agreed period of assessment. See the statement of common ground. That left 2 sites. I just pause there to say, Mr. Smythe, apologies for the typo. His subsequent suggestion in cross-examination to Brown that perhaps sites should be considered on a longer-term basis was, of course, entirely inconsistent with the agreed position and Mr. Phillips' own expert view. Mr. Phillips agreed in cross-examination that the council's latest 5-year housing land supply analysis is that there will be no extra care units of any sort coming forward before the end of 2026. And Kennet is expressly considered and nothing is coming forward. That left 1 site, Littleport, which again isn't in the 5-year supply. Why? Because the council, on very careful consideration, as per the scrutiny required under the MPPF, doesn't think it'll deliver C2 units in that timescale. And the latest evidence is that the developer isn't even taking the option available to them of bringing forward a care home on the site. It's a non-starter in terms of being a reasonable alternative to the appeal scheme. That's why Mr. Phillips agreed in cross-examination that on the evidence, there is no basis on which to conclude that any sites are likely to be brought forward to meet the need for private extra care within 5 years. And he also agreed in cross-examination that on the evidence, there would still be a need for about 200 units, that was his maths, in 2026, even with the appeal scheme consented and operational. In other words, it's now common ground that there are no reasonable alternative sites before the inquiry. And as set out at the start of these submissions, it's common ground that if that is the correct position, and it's common ground that it is, then permissions should be granted. The council therefore has no proper basis on which to continue to oppose the scheme, and its decision now not to formally accept that permission should be granted is patently unreasonable. Local plan compliance, as set out above, on the way to deciding whether there are very special circumstances, you so will need to consider the scheme against all relevant development plan policies. And it's common ground that the scheme doesn't comply with every policy, but of course it doesn't need to secure compliance with the plan as a whole, particularly given the overarching VSC test in EMV 10. It's common ground that EMV 1, 2 and HO6 don't comply with the MPPF. And so even if you did find a conflict with those policies, that conflict could only be given limited weight. See the previous appeal decision at 55. It's also common ground that the council's heritage policies don't contain the public benefits test set out in the MPPF. And so again, any conflict with those policies taken at face value can only be given limited weight, particularly where it's common ground that the scheme's public benefits do outweigh the low end, less than substantial harm that the scheme would cause to the conservation area and the setting of the listed building. And that harm must, of course, be given great weight, again, in accordance with the MPPF. And so for your reference, the St Albans decision is a really good example of how to determine a heritage greenbelt scheme. I'll give you the paragraph reference there just to see how sort of a policy approach is taken. The growth to HOU6 nexus is proven a little bit difficult to unpack. Read properly, the scheme doesn't fall under the HO6 exception as it's outside the settlement boundary. That's the first main paragraph of that policy. And it's not a care or a nursing home. Those are the bullet points. And that then takes us back to growth 2, which does allow exceptions if the scheme wouldn't cause significant harm to the character of the surrounding area. The scheme meets that test and so complies with growth 2, as Mr. Brown explained at the cross-examination. Importantly, of course, this aspect of growth 2 was subject to criticism by the previous inspector, meaning that if, contrary to Mr. Brown's position, conflict was found with growth 2, that again should be given limited weight given the conflict with the MPPF. Again, see paragraph 55 of the previous decision. And the adoption of the single issue review yesterday makes no difference whatsoever to that conclusion. Conclusion. So, sir, as I said in opening, and as all parties agree, the question at the heart of this appeal is simple. Do the benefits outweigh the harms? If they do, then the council agrees you should grant permission. And that is, as Mr. Phillips rightly agreed, the determinative policy text in this appeal. And in the end, our case is simple. The benefits the scheme will deliver are very substantial, the need is compelling, and it's common ground that on the evidence, the only conclusion to reach, the only conclusion open to you, sir, is that there are no other sites other than the appeal side that are going to come forward to deliver extra care housing inside the next 5 years. The situation now is unacceptable. That's common ground. It's only going to get worse. Ditto. The need for affordable housing is acute, and the council is again failing to meet the need. The scheme will also deliver a myriad of other social and economic benefits. The scheme's benefits will very clearly outweigh what will only be localised harm to the site and its immediate surroundings. The council's rejection of the scheme, let us remind ourselves, was finely balanced, and it was obviously anchored by its contention that there were reasonable alternative sites. The contention completely evaporated at the inquiry. Even on the council's approach, that's say even, for example, giving any significant weight to the needs case, accepting everything else the council says, it cannot sensibly said now that permission should be refused. The right conclusion is that taking everything into account and giving proper weight to everything, the balance of 148 of the MPPF tilts very decisively in favour of granting planning permission. And for those reasons, we ask you to allow the appeal. So a bit of admin towards the end in terms of the amended plans. The application is for outline permission with all matters except access reserved. The application as made complies with the 2015 audit in that it states where the proposed accesses would be, see Regulation 5. As discussed at the CMC, we invite you, sir, to determine the appeal on the basis of 2 revised plans, and I give you the references there. And that amendment to the scheme, should you accept it, would be secured by the imposition of a condition requiring the scheme to come forward in accordance with the revised plans. Case law establishes that it's permissible to amend schemes in that way. The key considerations being whether the changes are substantial and much more importantly, obviously, whether anybody would be prejudiced. It's common ground that no such issues arise here. They're minor changes in the bigger picture, and no one would be prejudiced by the introduction. And finally, there's no legal bar to using conditions to secure additional accesses on outline permissions where access isn't a reserved matter. Were it otherwise, it would be impossible to amend a properly made application where, as here, the suggestion of an additional access was made post-application, regardless of how good or necessary that amendment may be. The connection to the footpath 2510 to the west of the site would only need consent if physical works were being done. That would be by way of a section 278 agreement. There's no basis on which it could reasonably there's no basis on which it could reasonably be suggested that that wouldn't be secured. Mr. Phillips very kindly made that point earlier on, given the additional benefits it would deliver, and that it can therefore be secured by way of the condition that we are proposing. And as discussed in the general planning roundtable session, the removal of the row and close access makes the scheme a little less attractive in accessibility terms. That's Mr. Smythe's phrase. But it still meets all policy considerations, and accessibility should still be given positive weight in the planning balance, as Mr. Phillips accepted. Then some italics just typed up during the LPA's closings. So this was a criticism of the line taken by myself in cross-examination. I'd say came out of the blue to me today, which is a little disappointing, but here we go. The concessions made by Mr. Phillips in cross-examination were clear and were made in response to a clear and simple line of questions. At one point, Mr. Smythe interrupted, but did not in fact say any line of question was inappropriate, or more importantly, sir, asking you to make any ruling in respect to the questions being asked. To say that I thereafter persisted is correct only to the extent that the clear and simple lines of questions continued. Mr. Smythe is criticising your conduct of the inquiry in terms of this point about prejudice in cross-examining Mr. Canavan, but that is, with respect, nonsense. You, sir, took the time to expressly ask Mr. Smythe at the end of cross-examination whether he had any points to raise in that regard, and he said he did not. Had he really wanted to cross-examine Mr. Canavan, he would no doubt have asked that to happen. He expressly said he did not. It is surprising, and it is totally inappropriate to see that criticism in the council's closings. In terms of the 5-year housing land supply, that's paragraph 12A, that's not an issue, but it tells you nothing about the critical need for private extra care or affordable housing, particularly where the council's own analysis shows there's no private extra care in the 5-year supply. Greater onus on us, this is the alternative site assessment point, the LPA's decision, for whatever reason, not to adduce evidence on alternative sites takes nothing, it takes us no further, it's nothing to the point. It doesn't increase the onus on us, it just means the council didn't deduce a positive case that there are alternative sites. And on the evidence before the inquiry, and as the evidence before the inquiry demonstrates conclusively, and as Mr. Phillips fairly and repeatedly accepted, there are no other sites. What the LPA is really asking you to do, sir, let's step back from this, is to say that despite this being an area of acute need and sustained market failure, you should refuse the appeal and let the market take its course. despite the fact that at the very least, there will be no more units until well into the second half of the 10 years starting now. That, of course, would be a totally unacceptable position, as Mr. Phillips, got that the wrong way around, sorry, as Mr. Phillips himself expressly accepts. And then finally, delivery within the 5 years, that's the LPA's closings, paragraph 24A. The council completely, I mean, it really is baffling. This completely misunderstands the key point. We're looking at obviously sites that can start delivering units now. So the point that our site has taken more than 5 years to get to where we are now is totally irrelevant. So, sir, in conclusion, it's become absolutely obvious for everyone, so permission really should be granted so this can come forward without any further delay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't make a habit of asking questions about closing submissions for obvious reasons. I don't want to reopen the debate, but can I just ask about one of the paragraphs? You can explain the rationale behind the paragraph that's stated. You say in paragraph 21, it's common ground that policies EMV 1, 2 and HOU 6 do not comply with the framework, and so, and I won't read the rest of it. So your position is it's common ground. I mean, I will take away the evidence and have a look at the council's evidence as well, but where's that taken from?
And whether they have the recognition that's set out in the NPPF about the protection of the countryside. And I've given you the reference, sir. That's exactly the point that your predecessor inspector found at paragraph 55. So it's not the question of whether the scheme complies with those policies at face value. It's the point as to whether those policies comply with the NPPF.
No, I understand. And the implication of that is I determine the weight to be given to any conflict or
Absolutely.
otherwise with those policies. Understood.
Yes.
Just trying to understand where you say it's common ground, and that's fine. I will obviously review all the evidence and take a view on it ultimately anyway. So I'm not going to ask the council to make any submissions on that.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, those will be in your notes.
Thank you. So I have a copy of this. Please send an electronic copy as well. Thank you. So we have finished earlier than I anticipated, actually. We have concluded all the procedural matters of the inquiry. There's only a couple of issues I just need to quickly address. Both parties told me yesterday they weren't making an application for costs. I will check again. Mr. Walton. Okay, thank you. The Section 106 agreement will be submitted to me by Friday, the 3rd of November, which is 2 weeks today. If there are any issues with that, please contact me as soon as possible. Don't rely on an extension, but please do ask the question if there are legitimate reasons why that can't be completed in time. And finally, before I do close, is there any, this is the last chance. The only evidence I will accept after today is the Section 106 agreement, unless I choose to write to the parties requesting information or evidence. Is there anything that people wish to tell me in the room now before we close the inquiry? Mr. Smythe? No. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, so all that remains from me is just to say thank you to the council and to the appellant and various witnesses who've attended throughout the week, on some occasions for very short periods of time, and I appreciate people have to take time off other duties. Also to extend thanks to the council in terms of arranging the event, and I know we've had some challenges with the IT, but you have addressed those as quick as possible, and I appreciate your attendance here to address those issues we've had. All that remains for me to say is, particularly with the weather, please have a safe journey home today. The weather isn't good, I don't think, in most parts of the country. And it's now 10:35, so I'm going to formally close the inquiry and say thank you to everybody here.